Few scenes in Roman history are more terrifying than the fate of Cicero. His head, cut from his body, and his hands, still black with blood, were nailed to the rostra, the same platform where he had once stood as the proud defender of the Republic. The crowd gathered, staring in disbelief. The voice that had once risen against tyranny, the voice that had branded Mark Antony a threat to liberty, was gone. Cicero was silenced, not by words but by steel. It was not just an execution. It was a humiliation carved into both flesh and wood. Each nail driven into what remained of Cicero declared Antony's triumph. Each drop of blood marked the proof of his fall. After years of bitterness and rage, Mark Antony had finally taken his revenge, and he made certain that all of Rome would see it. Philosophy, freedom, and the art of politics died together with the man who had embodied them. But how could the greatest orator of Rome, the man whose words once bent senators to his will and set the people on fire, have met such a grotesque and public end? The answer lies not in one betrayal, but in a long war of words and ideals, a bitter struggle that pushed Antony to seek vengeance beyond death itself. This is the story of a humiliation repaid by a massacre. The story of how Mark Antony waited more than a year to arrange a last, dreadful reckoning with the rival who had once stripped him of his honor. Our story begins in the chaos that followed the Ides of March, 44 BC. Julius Caesar, dictator in life, lay dead upon the floor of the Senate, stabbed 23 times by men who called themselves liberators. They believed they had saved the Republic from tyranny. In truth, they had torn it apart, leaving behind a vacuum of power that threatened to devour the state. Two men quickly rose to dominate this broken scene. The first was Marcus Tullius Cicero. Though he was not among the assassins, Cicero became the very heart of the Republican cause. A novus homo, a new man without noble lineage, who had climbed the political ladder through his talent as a lawyer, speaker, and statesman. For him, the death of Caesar was a chance to restore the old Republic, to rid Rome of military strongmen, and to return rule to the Senate. The second was Mark Antony, a seasoned general hardened by years of war. Antony had been Caesar's right hand and his co-consul. To him, the assassins were not heroes, but traitors who had murdered his friend. He was a man of action, not of philosophy, and he held the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and the love of the Roman people. At Caesar's funeral, Antony delivered one of the most electrifying speeches in Roman history. His words ignited the crowd, turning public fury against the assassins and driving them into exile. For a moment, Antony stood at the height of his power. For several tense months, a fragile peace held. Surprisingly, Antony even made gestures toward reconciliation. He supported a law that abolished the dictatorship forever. It seemed, for a brief time, that Cicero and Antony might cooperate to lead Rome through the storm. But this truce was built on sand. Their visions of Rome could never be reconciled. Cicero dreamed of a republic ruled by law and ancient tradition, protected by the Senate's authority. Antony, molded by Caesar's legacy, believed in the strength of a single leader supported by military power. Distrust began to grow. To Antony, Cicero was an arrogant scholar, a man detached from real life. To Cicero, Antony was a brute, a tyrant in armor. Each of them represented everything the other despised. It was inevitable one of them would strike first. That blow did not come from a sword, but from Cicero's sharpest weapon, his voice. In the autumn of 44 BC, Cicero's patience with diplomacy ran out. He was convinced that Antony wanted to divert Caesar's heritage and make it the base of his own personal power. On September 2nd, Cicero appeared before the Senate and delivered a furious speech, the first of 14 attacks later known as the Philippics. Even the title itself was an insult. It echoed the speeches of the Athenian orator Demosthenes, who had once warned Greece about the tyranny of Philip II of Macedon. By choosing this title, Cicero portrayed himself as the defender of liberty, and Antony as the foreign invader standing at the gates of Rome. The speeches were devastating. Cicero did not simply criticize Antony's politics. He destroyed the man himself. He described him as a drunkard, a woman chaser, a coward, and a disgrace to Rome. The second Philippic was so merciless that Cicero did not even deliver it aloud. He published it so that all of Rome could read it. In those pages, Antony's life was depicted as a long story of corruption, debts, and scandals. "What does Antony have?" Cicero asked. "Except lust, cruelty, arrogance, and reckless audacity. He is completely filled with these vices." Copies of his speeches spread across the city like sparks on dry grass. For Antony, whose public image was his greatest strength, it was a humiliation like no other. The attacks wounded him deeply, destroying his reputation and marking him as an enemy of the Republic. Cicero's campaign achieved its goal, the Senate turned against Antony, and the Roman people followed. Cicero now gave his support to a new and rising figure amid the political storm: Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian, Caesar's 19-year-old adopted son. Cicero believed he could use Octavian as a weapon against Antony. The young man was ambitious, but also inexperienced. Cicero was convinced he could guide him, defeat Antony, and later remove Octavian once the Republic was restored. It was a gamble, a dangerous mistake in judgment. Humiliated and weakened by Cicero's campaign, Antony was declared a public enemy. He fled north to seize control of a province and its army. But during the Battle of Mutina in 43 BC, Antony was defeated. For a brief moment of glory, it seemed that Cicero had won. Antony became a fugitive, forced to cross the Alps in shame. Yet Cicero underestimated the strength of his rival and, even more, his capacity for hatred. As Antony tended his wounds in exile, the sting of Cicero's words burned more fiercely with every passing day. He had been mocked, vilified, stripped of honor. He would not forget. He waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike back, and that moment was approaching. The political landscape of Rome was changing at a dizzying speed. After the Battle of Mutina, the two consuls who commanded the Roman armies were killed in combat, leaving the young Octavian as the only remaining commander. When the Senate refused to give him the honors he claimed, Octavian marched his legions toward Rome. He seized the state treasury, declared himself consul, and then turned toward his former enemies. In November of 43 BC, Octavian met Antony and another of Caesar's generals, Lepidus, on a small island in the middle of a river. The three men made an agreement, the Second Triumvirate. Unlike Caesar's earlier and informal alliance with Pompey and Crassus, this was a 5-year dictatorship, legalized and approved by law. They received full powers to pass laws, to appoint officials, and, even more terrifying, to sentence anyone to death without a trial. Their first goal was to eliminate their enemies and raise money. To do this, they brought back one of Rome's most terrible customs, the proscriptions. Lists of the condemned were posted in the forum. All names written on them became those of outlaws. Their property was taken, and their murderers were rewarded. It was a massacre ordered and justified by the state. Ancient historians report that nearly 300 senators and 2,000 wealthy knights were condemned to death. Even family bonds were broken. Lepidus abandoned his own brother. Antony condemned his uncle. And Octavian, who had once admired Cicero, was persuaded to include the great orator's name among the proscribed. For 2 days, Octavian is said to have resisted, but Antony remained firm. The humiliation of the Philippics still burned in his mind like an unhealed wound. Cicero's name, Antony demanded, must appear at the top of the list. It was no longer about politics. It was revenge. The hunt for Marcus Tullius Cicero had begun. When Cicero learned that his name had been placed on the proscriptions, he understood that his end was close. He was 63 years old, weary and weakened by years of political struggle. At his villa near Tusculum, he first tried to escape. His brother Quintus, also condemned, went back to Rome to find money, but was soon captured and killed. Cicero headed south, hoping to find a ship bound for Macedonia. But his flight was slow, filled with hesitation and despair. He was a man who had fought for the Republic all his life, and now he watched it collapse around him. The old orator seemed almost reconciled with his destiny. According to Plutarch, Cicero complained bitterly, saying, "I shall die in the country that I have saved so many times." He boarded a ship for a short while, but seasickness forced him to return to the coast. Finally, he went back to his villa on the coast of Formii, as if he had accepted the inevitability of what was coming. It did not take long for Antony's men to find him. The squad was led by a centurion named Herennius and a military tribune named Popilius. It was a cruel irony, since Cicero had once defended Popilius in court against a charge of murder. When the assassins arrived, Cicero's servants prepared to resist, but he stopped them. He did not want their blood to be spilled because of him. Hearing the sound of soldiers approaching, he ordered his litter to be put down. His final moments were described by several ancient writers. Cicero, frail and exhausted, leaned out from his litter and calmly offered his neck. He touched his chin with a trembling hand, as if preparing himself for death. "There is nothing proper in what you do, soldier," he said, "but try to kill me well." Herennius lifted his sword. The first blow was clumsy. It took 3 strikes before Cicero's head was severed from his body. But Antony's orders went further than death. Execution alone was not enough. The instruments of Cicero's defiance had to be destroyed. The soldiers cut off his 2 hands, the very hands that had written the Philippics, the hands that had composed the words Antony could never forget. The severed head and hands were carried back to Rome. The killers displayed their bloody trophies before Antony in the Forum. Ancient sources say that Antony was delighted. He laughed, rewarded the murderers generously, and then commanded one last symbolic act of vengeance. Cicero's head and hands were nailed to the rostra, the sacred tribune at the heart of Rome. The same place where Cicero had once stirred the Republic with his voice now became a stage of silence and dread. The message could not be mistaken. The Republic's greatest orator was gone. His voice extinguished, his words silenced. Antony believed his legacy had been erased. But cruelty did not end there. The historian Cassius Dio records a grotesque epilogue. Antony's wife, Fulvia, bore her own hatred toward Cicero. He had mocked her in his speeches and had been the enemy of her first husband. When Cicero's head was brought before her, Fulvia spat upon it. Then, in a frenzy of hatred, she tore out the tongue, the very tongue that had once lashed Antony with its insults. Using the pins from her hair, she stabbed it again and again, mutilating the weapon that had wounded her family's pride. It was a horrifying reminder. Cicero's true power had never been his body, it had been his voice, and Antony and Fulvia wanted to ensure that this voice would be silenced forever. The display upon the rostra was not merely a personal vendetta. It was a political message, hammered into wood and flesh for all of Rome to see. The defenders of the Republic had been warned. "Speak, and this will be your fate." The symbolism was brutal and clear. Cicero had embodied the freedom of speech, the victory of words over swords. By mutilating his body and desecrating the sacred tribune of Roman oratory, Antony declared that the age of debate was over. From now on, Rome would be ruled by force and by blood. It was the death of free expression, nailed into the very heart of the Republic. Meanwhile, the Second Triumvirate continued its dark work. The proscriptions wiped out hundreds of Rome's most notable citizens. Their fortunes were confiscated, filling the coffers of Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus as they prepared to march against Caesar's assassins. It was a reign of terror, one that financed the final destruction of the Republic. With Cicero gone, Antony had removed his fiercest critic. The triumvirs could now march against Brutus and Cassius without dissent echoing in the Senate. In the short term, Antony had triumphed. He had avenged his humiliation. He had silenced the man he had once called a tyrant. For a brief moment, it seemed that the fate of the Republic was sealed. But irony was inevitable. Cicero had believed he could use Octavian as a pawn, a young, malleable instrument to restore the Republic and destroy Antony. But Octavian was no pawn. He was calculating, ambitious, and cunning, a strategist in his own right. By turning against Cicero, Octavian proved that he was not a puppet. He sacrificed the orator without hesitation when Antony demanded it. Cicero's dream of using Octavian to save the Republic turned against him spectacularly. The man who thought he could defeat soldiers with words was destroyed, not by an enemy's sword, but by the cold betrayal of the young man who had once stood at his side. The sight of Cicero's mutilated body haunted Rome for years. It became the darkest emblem of the Republic, the silencing of a man who had fought with words instead of armies. Antony had killed more than a man. He had tried to kill an idea. But even Antony could not silence Cicero's voice forever. His surviving speeches were copied and studied long after his body had vanished. His words continued to echo through centuries, long after Antony's victories had turned to dust. The struggle between the soldier and the orator had ended, but history had not yet given its final judgment. Mark Antony had taken his revenge. Cicero, the man who had humiliated him before the Senate and the people, the man who had branded him a tyrant, was gone. His head and hands rotted in public, a grotesque warning to all who dared to challenge Rome's new rulers. Antony had silenced his fiercest critic in the most degrading and public way imaginable. Yet if Antony had won the battle, the war for memory, legacy, and history itself was only beginning. In the short term, his triumph appeared complete. The Second Triumvirate crushed opposition, filled its armies with plunder, and marched east to confront Caesar's assassins. At Philippi in 42 BC, the forces of Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Both took their own lives. The last defenders of the old republic had fallen, and the triumvirs returned victorious. Rome was now firmly under military rule. Antony had destroyed Cicero, and with him the last great voice of republican liberty. His plans seemed to have succeeded. He silenced debate, crushed dissent, and avenged his honor. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The alliance of the triumvirs was not founded on loyalty but on necessity. Lepidus, the weakest of the three, was soon pushed aside. This left Antony and Octavian, Caesar's general and Caesar's adopted son, bound together in a fragile partnership. For a time, their alliance held. Antony took command of the East, while Octavian ruled in Rome. But mistrust grew quickly. Cunning and deliberate, Octavian began to shape himself as the defender of Roman tradition. Meanwhile, Antony, now enthralled by Cleopatra in Egypt, became an easy target. Octavian unleashed a propaganda campaign that rivaled Cicero's Philippics. He branded Antony as a traitor bewitched by a foreign queen, a Roman who had abandoned his own people. And in time, Octavian achieved what Cicero never could. He destroyed Antony not only through speeches but through war. Antony's story did not end in triumph, but in ruin. After years of rivalry, he and Cleopatra faced Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was a decisive defeat. The once powerful general withdrew to Egypt, trapped, disgraced, and without escape. There, in 30 BC, Antony fell on his own sword. Cleopatra followed him soon after. Antony had outlived Cicero by more than a decade, yet his legacy was eclipsed by the very man he had once dismissed as a child. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Cicero's death had been brutal and humiliating, but his legacy endured far beyond Antony's triumphs. Antony could nail his hands to the tribune, but he could not destroy the words those hands had written. Cicero's speeches outlasted the fall of the Republic. His philosophy, his defense of law and freedom, continued to resonate through the centuries. Rome buried the Republic, yet Cicero's writings ensured that the ideals of liberty and representative government were never completely extinguished. His works were copied, studied, and revered. More than 1,000 years later, the Renaissance rediscovered them. His reflections on law, duty, and the Republic inspired thinkers across Europe. Centuries later, the founding fathers of the United States looked to his writings, using them as a foundation for their own republic. The man whom Antony had tried to silence became one of the most influential voices in Western political thought. History's judgment of Antony is far less kind. He is remembered as a brilliant general, yes, but also as a man defeated by ambition, passion, and resentment. His vengeance on Cicero, once seen as a terrifying display of authority, now appears as a desperate act of spite. For though Antony won in his lifetime, Cicero won in memory. Antony's Rome was fleeting, his power ephemeral. Cicero's Rome, the Rome of debate, of law, of words as weapons, was immortalized through his writings. The contrast could not be sharper. Antony destroyed Cicero's body. Cicero destroyed Antony's reputation. The death of Cicero was more than a personal tragedy. It marked the turning point of an age. It was the moment when the ideals of the Republic surrendered to the rise of empire, when words lost their power to swords. His mutilation on the rostra was meant to terrify, to prove that freedom of speech had no place in Antony's Rome. But instead, it made Cicero a martyr for liberty. His death became a warning, a reminder that even when power silences a man, it cannot erase his words. As Cicero wrote in his final Philippic, "If the life of a man is short, the memory of a life without surrender is eternal." And in this he was right. His body perished, his republic collapsed, but the memory of his words endured. The clash between Cicero and Antony remains one of the most poignant duels in history, not only between two men, but between two visions of Rome: the statesman and the soldier, the voice and the sword, the republic and the empire. For a moment, Antony's sword triumphed, but history sided with Cicero. His speeches continued to shape human thought long after Antony's victories had crumbled into dust. Even today, his words are studied, his arguments admired, his legacy revered. Antony is remembered as the tragic general who chose the wrong side of history, and Cicero, imperfect, ambitious, yet unyielding in his ideals, endures as a martyr of freedom, the man who died defending a republic that could no longer be saved. In the end, the death of Cicero teaches a timeless lesson. Power can silence a voice, but it cannot kill an idea. Antony nailed Cicero's head and hands to the rostra to proclaim the death of debate. But Cicero's words refused to die. Rome would continue forward, ruled by emperors instead of senators. Antony's vengeance would fade into history, but Cicero's writings would live on, shaping minds from St. Augustine to Thomas Jefferson. The orator who faced his killers with calm dignity outlived them all. His mutilated body may have been Antony's final victory, but his immortal words belong to Cicero. Though Antony killed the man, Cicero won the war of memory. The republic he loved was gone, but his vision of freedom endured, not carved in marble or nailed to wood, but engraved forever in history.